This talk is the fourth in a series on our relationships and on the application, really, or the inquiry into the Four Noble Truths as they are reflected in our practice of relationship. And again, by relationship, we don't necessarily mean that romantic or intimate relationship. It might be. But it could be the relationship with the guy who fixes your plumbing, or that person on the telephone who interrupted your work this morning. It could be a relationship with anyone. And tonight I wanted to continue a bit with the second noble truth and lean into the third noble truth, which we'll continue with the next time. And before I start, I would just invite you to bring into your own mind a relationship that you find a bit challenging. Perhaps not the very most challenging one, that one where the person is evil incarnate, but one that you find, one that you kind of keep coming back to as one that's a little challenging, or perhaps even one that's recent, where you had a little run-in somehow today or yesterday with someone. It's so interesting, isn't it? We can kind of do all these studies and do all the readings and do all the practice, and we have these moments with another person, and it kind of all flies out the window, We kind of, we just forget, or it has no bearing whatsoever on these moments of relationship. So just bring into your mind maybe a particular relationship that you'd like to maybe know just a tiny bit more about by the end of the evening. And I'll just invite you as we go through to keep applying what we're investigating to this relationship. See if it works. See if it works. So the talks that I've done so far really have been around the first and the second noble truths, where in the first noble truth the Buddha says there's dukkha, there's suffering in this human life. And indeed that suffering is to be known, to be felt, to be experienced. And you can look in your own body and your own mind right now in this relationship that you're inquiring into. And just see, well, what exactly, what does that mean? Really, the Buddha invites us into an embodied practice. Can we know the experience directly in our own bodies? This is hard. And the key thing there, or a key thing, is that this is universal, this difficulty. And we can notice as we come into these moments of difficulty, sometimes the attitude of the mind that we kind of go, no, it's actually not it's not universal, it's really unique to me. Or more likely, it's unique to this other person who's really causing so much problem in the world. But the Buddha says, no, it's actually not unique. It's part of our human condition. It's just part of the deal. And he invites us to know this quality of dukkha, and as it's manifested in relationship. Of course, that's not all there is in our human life or in our human relationships. There certainly are moments that are very loving and compassionate and spacious as well. So we don't want to forget that. We don't want to be confused that somehow life is, only dukkha. But by the same token, we don't want to be confused and imagine that those moments of spaciousness are somehow, the baseline or the standard, or will be terribly discouraged. The Buddha talks about, or not the Buddha, but the Taoists talk about the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. In relationship too. 10,000 joys, 10,000 sorrows. Last week I talked about the Buddha's teaching on the causes of suffering as tanha, or hunger, craving. Sometimes translated as desire, which can be very, very confusing. Because we can kind of object almost immediately and say, well, wait a minute, isn't there a wholesome desire? Absolutely, it's actually a different word. In Pali, it's the word chanda, where the wholesome desire, those places where we really approach relationships with a wholehearted love and compassion. Tanha has a different quality, the unwholesome aspect of desire, this hunger, and as it applies to relationship. I invite you, I'm going to read a couple things, and invite you to just kind of contemplate this relationship and just see if there's that kind of hunger there. The Buddha talked about 3 kinds of hunger that are just universal. It's part of our wiring as human beings. It's just part of the deal again. You know, it's like having hair. Just part of the deal. We hunger for what's pleasant. We're little animals. We turn toward what's pleasant. We hunger to exist. Relationally, that means we hunger to exist in the eyes of another person. We want to be seen, to be valued, to be important, to be listened to be acknowledged. We hunger to be safe. And so we can see these qualities of hungers, these hungers manifesting throughout our lives, and we can see them manifesting in our relationships. Here's a description of hunger. Tanha, hunger, craving, is the Pali word for that total craving that hollows our heart. It is desire that has metastasized and become ravenous, an itch that keeps us constantly scratching, a subtle restlessness. More, 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 more. Not enough, not enough, not enough, not enough, not good enough, not yet, not yet, not yet. The crucial essence of tanha is captured by the notion of unquenchable thirst, a thirst which can never be fully satisfied or quenched, but which tragically we nonetheless feel compelled to keep trying to satisfy. It is this fatal combination of the unquenchability of the desire coupled with our unwillingness to simply let go that creates suffering. You know, so something's not pleasant enough, or I'm not seen enough, or I'm not safe enough. Attachment to the desire that has a compulsive quality, a subtle or not so subtle sense that we need things to be one way or another. This compulsion is reflected in our felt experience and inner language, which are dominated by a sense of must, should, ought, have to, need to, if only. And again, make the distinction in your own awareness between chanda, this wholesome desire, and the tanha, which has that quality of stickiness, of craving. What for me is a good example, I had a relative who had a substance abuse problem, and there certainly was a wholesome desire for that person to be free of the addiction. But as I inquired and investigated, I could also see a quality of tanha. You know, this sort of insistence that things had to work out in some particular way. So to kind of really inquire, where does chanda turn into tanha, and just see it. And it's part of our wiring, this sense of this sort of animal instinct, if you will, that we have to exist, we have to have pleasant experiences, we have to be safe. I keep thinking about little lizards, and just how they respond to the ordinary ups and downs of little lizard life, and that we have that kind of quality embedded in our own brains. And so the Buddha invites us to see it, to know it, to just see it, to not criticize or give ourselves a hard time because it's there, because we're human beings, but to see it, because if we don't see it, we start to act on it, and we start to do all sorts of things that aren't so wholesome. One of the things that we do that's not so wholesome is that we create identifications around these kinds of cravings. We create whole stories and whole scenarios, whole dramas, whole plays around them. We make, in our own minds, we make it that somebody is this. That there was a moment in time where something happened that was perhaps unpleasant. And so then somebody is that for now and forever. I remember someone told me a story one time. It was so touching, actually. It was about one of the politicians who was very central in the Bush administration. And really very central in all the goings to war. And I realized as this person was telling me the story that I had formed a whole mental image of this person. But she told me a story about someone she knew who had been at a party at one time with people who actually knew this other person. I don't want to name him because it's not so wholesome. But people who had been at a party who had known him, and they were talking about him. And somebody said, "What happened to him?" And it was so touching because it was such an inquiry into, this awareness of that's not really who he is. What happened? So it was an inquiry that there was this person who wasn't insisting on making an identification, but was allowing himself to just be really hurt and puzzled and curious. What happened? And we can, again reference this, whatever this difficult person is, that you're thinking of, and just wonder, what happened? Is that who that person is? 100%? What happened? So one of the things that Tanha really pushes us to do is to make things, very kind of solid or a this way rather than a that way, because it makes our brains happier. It actually does. Our brains don't like to have all this ambiguity or all this uncertainty. Our brains like to have the pleasure of knowing. Brains like to have that kind of pleasant experience. Our brains like to have the pleasure of having things feel like they're under control. Like we have some agency, that we're not just, in fact, little lizards who are, at the kind of mercy, if you will, of the elements. And our brains like to have some sense that we're safe, ultimately, that we're safe. So our brains keep trying to kind of take these hungers and kind of push them into some kind of very solid form from which we then operate. So now there's an I who's relating to this difficult person. And depending on our point of view, I don't know about you, but 90% the I is really pretty skillful and the other person is not so much. Sometimes it reverses for a brief moment. But that we kind of form these like identifications and these ideas about things out of tanha, out of this craving, out of this wanting things to be predictable and in control and safe and pleasant. And the brain just constructs all this, trying to make life simpler. But what ends up happening is that we then kind of live inside these constructions, and this is one of the things that just pulls us right into our suffering. Because actually what it does is it actually pulls us out of actual life into a drama, a soap opera of some sort. So tanha, this kind of craving. I was thinking too, as psychotherapists, people often would ask, how can you be with, it'd be sort of like, how can you be with someone who, all day? Whereas sort of there's a sort of imagining that we sort of sit with that kind of a construction. And then we kind of work to try to get somebody to be a different construction, the construction that I have in my head, how you should be. They have this fantasy that that's what we do. And oh my goodness, would that be hard or what? So that as psychotherapists, I think of our challenge really is to kind of just really be with the whole fluidity of it. And to really help people kind of step out of their own constructions into a more wholesome kind of quality of just this fluidity of how life unfolds. Which requires actually, I teach psychotherapists a lot, which requires us to really be very, very, very good at not knowing. And at being willing to just kind of show up and be curious. And so again, with this difficult person, you can kind of investigate. Is it hard to be curious? Is it hard to show up? And it begins to point us to the place where we really begin to suffer, doesn't it? Where we kind of go, I can't be curious about that. It's too painful, it's too hard. And if I'm curious about it, maybe I'll have to abandon any sense that I can fix it or make it be different in some way. I have to abandon that sense that I'm in control. So our suffering really is fed so much by our insistence that things be a certain way. And this tanha, this craving, is fed, the Buddha tells us, by clinging. So again, tanha is sort of the nature of things, if you will, these hungers. But it's the clinging that sort of feeds little sticks to the fire. We cling in lots of different ways. I want to talk about 3 of them. One is we cling to what's pleasant. We insist, that things must be pleasant. If I'm going to be happy, things must be pleasant. And if they're not pleasant, I must make them pleasant somehow. So we cling to this sense of pleasant. We don't want to allow the pleasant to pass, which it does. I was talking to someone just not too long ago who was newly in love. And he said, what did he say? He said, I hope it doesn't get any better than this, because I couldn't stand it. And I told my husband, and he said, did you tell him it gets worse? I said, no, I couldn't bear to. But we know it does, doesn't it? Someone once said that the reason people cry at weddings is that they're married. And it just changes, It's like you go through periods that it's just heaven. And then it changes. We grow, we change, it changes. So to try to hang on to something in some particular form. Or we have these wonderful little babies, or this wonderful 4-year-old, or this. I was talking to a friend who has had a little friend who was 11, And they have just the best time. They go and they do things together. And guess what? She's becoming a teenager, you know? And there's really just this tremendous letting go that has to happen, you know? So there's all this beauty and pleasantness, and it changes. Well, what if all of the unpleasantness changes too? You see how we want to kind of get it, that quality of safety, that we kind of get it in our own minds that, okay, you know, this person was unkind or unpleasant, you know, in 1963, and that's who they are. You know? And it'll never be different. Or even in a moment to moment, you know, we're with someone, you know, and it just keeps moving and morphing. So we want to kind of hang on to whether it's the pleasant of the experience or at the very least the pleasant quality of knowing it's like this. And the mind doesn't want to let go and know that it was like that once, at least in part, but maybe it's not like this. There's some kind of permanent, stable thing. The second way that we cling is we cling to our ideas about things. We form ideas. We have interpretations. We have impressions. We have beliefs. And we cling to them, again, because it gives us some sense of control or some sense of stability. Who is this? This is from Gregory Kramer, one of my teachers. He says, clinging to views, clinging to our ideas, includes clinging to our stories about ourselves and others. We see ourselves as having a certain role in a relationship or in society. Long-term relationships come laden with details of the past, and we cling to these stories. We hold to the anger, the pleasure, the safety, the complexity that they imply. Even when we meet someone new, there is the view of who they are according to gender or color or economic station or function in our lives and so on. You know, we sort of plunk people into categories. And this view of them interacts with the view of who I am. We cling to the patterns at this intersection of us and them, and we suffer. You know, so even the woman who called me this morning asking for, you know, the online or the telephone marketer asking for a donation. You know, I have an idea, I have a view, I have a perception of who this person is, you know, which causes then a certain kind of quality of mind and heart and a certain quality of action. This is who I am, and this is who you are. And it's sort of, you know, I would reference again the story about the politician. I remember reading a story about George Bush, and there was something about him loving to fish. You know, and my husband loves to fish. And I could just sort of watch that I really kind of didn't want to know that, you know? You know? Oh, he is a person too. And it's really lovely. You know, I've read quite a number of things that apparently he's just a very, very personable, and, you know, people really like being in his presence. You know? And he likes to fish, you know? He's just a person. And we might disagree with some things that he believes or says or does, but he's just a person, and he's just as mixed as we are. We can do that about our parents. You know, we grow up with these stories of who our parents are, or for that matter, who our children are. There's a poem I've read to you before. I'll read it again. The title is Those Winter Sundays. I love it for this. It sort of reflects exactly this issue. He says, Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well, what did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So again, just reflect for a moment on this difficult person. What do we know? What do we know? We cling also to practices and precepts, ways of doing things, fixed ways of doing things. We have an idea, I think of it as my 11-year-old self, the 11-year-old in the back seat who says, you're going 36 in a 35-mile zone. My daughter told me that once. I said, yes, thank you, I know. But we have this 11-year-old self that has ideas. These are the rules. This is how it's done. And people who don't follow our rules automatically become difficult. And we kind of hang on to them. We go, but I'm right. It is 35. Or you should, whatever it is. So we really kind of hang on to these precepts, these ideas. And it's the clinging that transforms our hunger really into suffering. That place, I want to read to you again and some of the words. This was about tanha. This must, should, ought, have to, need to, if only. That kind of tension. We can identify tanha and the kind of suffering by the flavor of it, this sort of burning, sticky, mentally kind of muddled, yucky, reactive kind of place that we find ourselves. And so the Buddha invites us to first of all know the dukkha, to know the hunger, to look and see, what am I hungry for? And to look and see the clinging. And for starters, to simply see it. Just see it. Just see it. Because what we tend to do is we tend to live inside it. We tend to inhabit the tanha. We tend to inhabit the hunger. We tend to inhabit the clinging. And then we tend to just act so quickly out of it that we're sort of just caught in the reactivity. And we don't even know we are because it's so habitual. And all the beliefs that we carry about how hopeless and impossible this relational circumstance is. So when we find ourselves in that suffering, the Buddha invites us to kind of step backward, if you will, to look for the clinging, to look for the tanha, to really know the dukkha, and to really kind of begin to investigate. I did a series on the factors of mindfulness, and the second one is investigate. The first one is mindfulness, just knowing the experience. The second one is investigation. What is this? What's the hunger? What's the clinging? What's going on here? Can I begin to inquire and just know the quality of the experience? This is Gregory again. It's important to dwell intimately with our own experience of clinging and see this for ourselves. Can we feel in the body the tension of holding onto an idea or emotion? What does that moment look like, feel like, when the flow of thought that is known by mindfulness turns into a me who is thinking of this? There is a kind of appropriation of experience driven by the energy of hunger that in aggregate gives rise to a feeling of pressure in the body-mind. And we know that kind of pressure in relationship, don't we, in these difficult relationships. That place where actually we too will go to war. Right? Or there's some kind of pressure. The three forms of sensual and relational hunger we explored for pleasure, being, and non-being, now he's talking about hunger, are deeply set in our biology and psychology. Being born into a body and into this relational life, these hungers will manifest. However, when hunger is not accompanied by clinging, there is no suffering. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? When hunger is not accompanied by clinging, there is no suffering. There may be physical pain or pleasure. There may be a hunger for contact with other people. But in the absence of grasping or clinging, the experience rises and vanishes without a trace. Clinging is the pivot point on the path to freedom. So my friend with her 11-year-old friend, there's sadness, huh? There's a wishing for the pleasure and a sadness at its loss. But it's the clinging, it's the kind of stickiness of it that is the real quality of hunger. The Buddha says, nothing whatsoever should be grasped at or clung to. Easy for him to say. Well, actually it wasn't. The Buddha was pretty diligent in his practice. So in the next talk, we'll inquire a little bit about, what do you do with clinging? How do you work with it? So tonight we're just sort of inviting ourselves to kind of just know the dukkha, know the hunger, investigate, know the clinging. Really to begin to investigate. So that we can kind of know the place of the difficulty. Just like a physician might know, it's like, oh, here's the diagnosis, here's the place where the illness is. We can begin to identify for ourselves, oh, this is the place of the illness. And the Buddha invites us to know that the illness exists in our own minds. It's not out there. And we can watch the objection to that, that we keep wanting to kind of make it out there. But the wonderful thing about really inviting the awareness that it's in our own minds, it means then that freedom is in our own minds as well. We don't have to make the world some particular way. That the freedom is in our own minds. We train, we practice, first with an understanding of what we are doing, a fearless willingness to see things as they are, cultivating and strengthening wholesome intention. We talked about that some last time. Then with a day-to-day, moment-to-moment practice with this dukkha, this relationship. We could speak endlessly about the specific things that we cling to. This or that possession or praise or job, this or that anger or jealousy, relationship or teaching. We might be humbled into understanding the many ways we cling. But to take in a teaching like this, we are called to immense patience, unending kindness, and a good sense of humor about how mired we are. If we are kind in this way, we are safe in letting this teaching touch us. And this is from the Buddha. He says, the purpose of the holy life does not consist in acquiring alms, honor, or fame, nor in gaining morality, concentration, or the eye of knowledge. That unshakable deliverance of the heart, that, verily, is the object of the holy life. That is the essence, that is the goal. The unshakable deliverance of the heart. The heart that is open in loving kindness and compassion, patience, generosity. wisdom. Wisdom, by the way, can include leaving a relationship. It's more a matter of how we would do that and why we would do that. But the unshakable deliverance of heart, this cultivating over and over again and using these difficult relationships to cultivate over and over again this quality of unshakable deliverance of heart, which is where our freedom is, not in external circumstances. So we'll talk a little bit more next time about clinging more specifically and begin to lean into how to work with clinging and into the fourth noble truth. The third noble truth is that, release and freedom is possible. And the fourth noble truth is here's how to do it. Now, don't come, expecting a pill, but it's a practice. It's a way of cultivating, training our hearts. Unshakable deliverance of heart. I love that phrase. This is a poem. I'll close with a poem by Kabir. He says, I said to the wanting creature inside me, what is this river you want to cross? There are no travelers on the river road and no road. Do you see anyone moving about on that bank or nesting? There is no river at all and no boat and no boatman. Meaning there's nothing permanent. There is no tow rope either and no one to pull it. There is no ground, no sky, no time, no bank, no ford. And there is no body and no mind. Do you believe there is some place that will make the soul less thirsty? In that great absence you will find nothing. Be strong then and enter into your own body. There you have a solid place for your feet. Think about it carefully. Don't go off somewhere else. Kabir says this, just throw away all thoughts of imaginary things and stand firm in that which you are, which, by the way, the Buddha tells us is an unshakable deliverance of heart. So our practice is a way of cultivating that awareness and cultivating over and over this really deep and unshakable standing firm in that which you are, no matter what the relational circumstances. So we'll pause there for tonight. We have a couple more talks in this series. I keep going on. And I wish you ease in those relationships and touching into that unshakable deliverance of heart, your heart. So many blessings.